very honored tonight to have Dr. Raymond Damadian, the inventor of the MRI, probably the most important invention in medicine in the second half of the 20th century, and maybe the entire 20th century. Dr. Damadian was born in New York. He studied violin at the Juilliard for 8 years and almost became a concert violinist. He played tennis for the Junior Davis Cup. He then won a scholarship and studied math at Wisconsin, whereafter he was graduated from Albert Einstein in medicine and then studied internal medicine. And while studying internal medicine, he became fascinated with sodium and potassium ions and how they govern not only neurological flow but ion exchange in the kidneys and were essential for human life. And he, a man of great perseverance, he stuck with this, and this led him to looking at the concentrations of sodium in living cells, and he had to find a bacteria from the Dead Sea that had very high sodium concentrations in order to demonstrate his thesis. And this led him to the use of using magnetic coils, and then to the notion that somehow you could use magnetic irradiation to differentiate cancer from normal cells. And in 1969, he decided he would build a magnetic resonance imaging device. And he published some early work, and I'm afraid at Hopkins they said this is a fanciful notion and wouldn't work. And Peter Rowe sitting over there, Claire Francomano just coming in, and Dr. Don Long, chairman of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins for 40 years. Nevertheless, not only did he conceive of the notion of using MR for this, but then he set about actually building a machine, which is really astonishing, because the physical demands of building a machine that weighs many tons were just extraordinary. And they had to, for instance, and he'll tell you the story, get 150,000 feet of titanium alloy wire in order to build a superconducting magnet to build this first MR. At any rate, he succeeded. And then, having thought up the idea and then having built the device with able assistance, he was the first to get into it, which took some courage, because the previous lab animal, a mouse, was literally fried inside the magnet. So no one knew what would happen when a living person got inside. But he did, and this led to the development of the first MRI. And he subsequently developed the machine to do dynamic MRIs, so that now we can look at dynamic problems with a dynamic MRI. We can look at it in flexion, upright extension, and we can look at CSF flow. We can look at movement of the ligaments and bones and the central nervous system in a truly dynamic situation, which is clearly much more physiological. And Dr. Damadian is going to discuss some of his extraordinary findings with this dynamic MRI. And before I should mention that his first machine, the Indomitable, is now at the Smithsonian. In 1988, he received the National Medal of Technology from President Reagan. In 1989, he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. He received the Lemelson MIT Prize Lifetime Achievement Award. He also developed an MRI-compatible pacemaker. He was bestowed the Bowie Award by the Franklin Institute. He was named Man of the Year in 2003 by the Knights of Varta. And in 2018, his greatest award, he received the CSF Medal of medical excellence for his contributions to study of PRA and hydrodynamics. So I'd like to just say we're also honored to have Dr. Dworkin here, Dr. Don Long, Claire Francomano, Sarah Merritt, Dr. Alphabaum, Dr. Kevin Lasko, Dr. Miles Kirby, Alan Pusinki, Peter Rowe, and are you a doctor?
Dr. Mark Quigley.
Dr. Mark Quigley, right. From Quigley down under. So I give you Man of the Year, Dr. Damadian.
Before I start, I'd just like to make a comment for you to listen carefully when I talk about the cranial cervical syndrome. And the reason I want to say that is that it's not being diagnosed anywhere. And it's a major difficulty. And I'm just bringing it to your attention because there's a real possibility that it's afflicting a family member, friends, or others, and they're not being diagnosed. I'll be discussing the clinical syndrome, but I just want to alert you that there's a real possibility that somebody in your immediate vicinity has this difficulty, and if you I want you to know that it's readily treatable if you make the right diagnosis. All right, thank you, Jay. Now, I'm starting you with the first introduction of how I got started in all of this. And when I got started in research, what captured my attention was this extraordinary phenomenon of the electricity of life. That everyone seated in the room today is a Con Ed plant. And you're generating your own electricity. And when life comes to an end, the Con Ed plant shuts off. So how does the living tissue and the living cell go about the job of generating the electricity of life? Well, the first scientists that explored this were Professors Hodgkin and Huxley in the United Kingdom, who came to the conclusion that what was generating the voltage was this asymmetric distribution of this atom on the inside of the cell, the potassium atom. And what was characteristic in natural chemistry of the potassium atom and the sodium atom is they didn't run around naked. They carried a positive net charge. And Hodgkin and Huxley observed that if you took the amount of potassium, which was 150 millimoles per liter on the inside of the cell, as compared to the 4 millimoles per liter on the outside, and took those two contents and stuck them into a standard battery equation, you got the very voltage that you measured with a probe that was stuck into the cell. Now, the other curiosity in all of this was, well, wait a minute, why potassium? The ubiquitous atom is sodium. It's in the tissue everywhere. So how come the cell is doing this peculiar idiosyncrasy of accumulating potassium and excluding sodium? Well, Hodgkin and Huxley addressed that one and proposed the hypothesis that there was a protein on the surface of the cell that was pumping potassium in and pumping sodium out. And it was named the sodium pump. Well, when I first encountered this, I was at Washington University in St. Louis, and I said to my professor, Neil Bricker, I said, well, Dr. Bricker, has anybody isolated that pump? And his answer was, the guy who does that's going to win the Nobel Prize. In any case, not long after that, I took a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard, and my professor was Professor Arthur K. Solomon, who was the professor of biophysics, and he said to me, Damadian, he said, what do you want to do here? I said, well, Dr. Solomon, the thing that I think would be kind of interesting would be to go about the research to try to isolate this phenomenal pump that's generating all the electricity of life. He said, oh, you came to the right place, Damadian. I said, what are you talking about, Thomas? He said, well, we're very much oriented in that direction, and we have a proposal that you could follow up on. I said, what's that, Dr. Solomon? He said, well, we suggest that you do, number one, do the experiments of all of this on bacteria, and secondly, propose that you go ahead and use mutagens and make a mutant of E. coli that can't normally accumulate potassium. Because then, Damadian, what you'll have is you'll have two collections of proteins, the proteins from the parent strain, the protein from the mutant. You can go ahead and do the fractionation of the proteins. The protein that doesn't match up, Damadian, that's your pump. I said, well, wait a minute, Dr. Solomon. I said, you know, this phenomenon of the pump is so fundamental to the electricity of life. How do I know I'm going to be able to isolate such a bacteria that can't accumulate potassium and live long enough for me to isolate it as a mutant? And his answer was, that's your problem, Damadian. So anyway, I proceeded, and within a couple of months, I got a mutant of E. coli that could not accumulate potassium. And so then I started at Harvard, and I started fractionating the proteins, looking for this pump. And I did it at Harvard for about 6 months. I had this mutant. At that point, I was inducted into the Air Force, and I went to the School of Aerospace Medicine in Houston, Texas. And my colonel, becoming aware that I had this mutant that couldn't accumulate potassium, said, well, gee, maybe what we'd like is for you to continue your research while you're in the Air Force here, as long as you will add to your experiments as you go along the rocket fuel that we're contracted to use, hydrazine, and I'd like to have you continue your search for that pump. I said, okay, well, that's great. And so I continued looking for it for another 2 years, all the time I was in the Air Force, and I'm not finding it. Finally, I then joined the faculty at the State University of New York in the Downstate Medical Center, and I set up my lab, and I'm looking for this pump for another 6 months. I said, at the end of 6 months of doing this, I said, hey, Damadian, you've been doing this for three years. I said, you better go to the literature and find out the extent for which there is genuine scientific evidence for the existence of this sodium pump. Well, I went to the library, and the first thing I ran into, it's not, the first thing I ran into was a monograph by a professor at the University of Pennsylvania named Gilbert Ning Ling. And what I encountered was a monograph they had just written of 500 pages saying there was no pump, and provided extensive evidence for the non-existence of this pump. And he named it the association induction hypothesis, and his basic proposal was it wasn't being pumped in, but the ion was sticking to the negative charges with the structure of the cell. The carboxylate groups in proteins and the phosphates in nucleic acid. And in fact, what he said was that the association of the ion with the countercharge, in fact, induced the voltage that enabled the selection of potassium over sodium. Well, when I saw that, I had a similar thought, and I thought about it in a slightly different way. And I was very well aware of these products called ion exchange resins, which you put in chromatography columns to chromatographically separate the samples. And so I came to the conclusion that, well, the cell is just like an ion exchange resin. The potassium atom is sticking to the negative charges of the cell. And in the course of doing that, and you're still addressing this question, why is it accumulating potassium and not sodium? I became aware in my search that these manufacturers of these ion exchange resin beads, like Dow Chemical and others, had a resin bead that selectively accumulated potassium, and it didn't have a pump to help them do it. So I said, well, let me see what the chemists say about how their ion exchange resin beads selectively accumulate potassium without a pump. Well, their answer was that these ions, sodium and potassium, don't run around in the natural state naked. But in fact, they run around with an atmosphere of water around them. And if you looked more specifically at the electric charge of the sodium ion as compared to the electric charge of the potassium ion, the sodium ion was smaller, but it had the same charge. So the charge per square centimeter of surface was higher in the sodium ion because it was smaller than the charge per square centimeter in the potassium ion. And in the presence of water, which is the way it existed, that negative charge that you see here on the scan would attract water, because water in its natural state is a dipole. So that if you looked at the oxygen end of the H2O molecule, it was negative relative to the hydrogen end, which was positive, and those dipoles would stick to these ions. And the fully hydrated ion would be basically what is circulated, and the fully hydrated sodium ion was therefore, as a result of the higher charge density, be bigger than the fully hydrated potassium ion, and that's why the ion exchange resins accumulated potassium, and because it took up less space, and not sodium. Well, as a result of doing this research, and I published some of it, I got a phone call from this gentleman here, who was a research scientist and a doctor, Freeman Thorndike Cope, whose ancestor wrote the Thorndike Dictionary. And he says, Damadian, he says, I've been reading your papers. He said, how'd you like to prove what you've been asserting? I said, what are you talking about, Cope? I said, well, there's this new technology, and I can show you in the back, which I have been using, called NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance. And I want everybody to know that the current name that we use for this technology is MRI. They are the same thing. NMR equals MRI. And the reason that all of this happened is that when we started introducing the technology to the clinical world, the clinical people wanted the N out of there because it implied nuclear radiation, and the radiologists wanted to add I to make it an imaging technology, so NMR became MRI. But they're synonyms. They're virtually the same thing, and I think you need to know that. So he suggested that we get together and try to make these measurements. So we went out to a small company on the outskirts of Pittsburgh in New Kensington, Pennsylvania, and one more thing. When he came to me and we were talking about this, he came back about 2 weeks later. He said, well, Damadian, he says, I think I have a problem. I said, what's that? I said, you had told me that you didn't think this was going to be difficult. He said, well, I've looked into it in more detail, and I've examined the magnetic moment of the potassium atom, and it's not all that great. And furthermore, when you look at the amount of potassium that's on the inside of the cell, that too is not all that great, and I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get a signal at all. I said, well, Cope, maybe I can help there. I said, what are you talking about? I said, well, I know of a bacteria from the Dead Sea called the Halobacter halobium that has 20 times the amount of potassium in it. If I could get that, Cope, it might increase the prospect of us getting an NMR signal from this potassium atom inside the cell. I said, can you get it? I said, I don't know. I said, but I'll try. Well, I was able to get the bacteria from the Dead Sea, and so we went out to this company in New Kensington, Pennsylvania, that made these NMR machines that were able to make the signal and measure the decay rate of that signal. And so I grew the bacteria up, I put them in a test tube, I gave it to Cope, and this is what the magnets looked like at that time. these are the two magnet poles, and the only opening it had was 2¼ inches. And you're looking at the sample in the center with the antenna wrapped around it that detects and produces the signal. So I gave it to him. I grew them up at the University of Pittsburgh, and I took big 30 lat of culture, spun them down, gave this pellet to him. I gave it to Cope. He put it in the scanner, and he measured it in like less than a minute. I said, Cope, I can't believe what you just did. What are you talking about, Damadian? I said, in a measurement that would normally take me 2-3 days if I didn't drop the test tube, you put it inside that completely non-invasively, and you measured the potassium without doing anything to the sample. I said, Cope, do you realize that if we could ever do something like that on a human body, it would enable us to go from one tissue to the next, get its chemistry with non-invasively? And I said it would spark an unprecedented revolution in medicine. He wasn't terribly intrigued. He says, I don't even know where you would begin. I said, well, there, Cope, I got an idea. He said, what are you talking about, Mayor? I said, well, I know from the work that I've done and looking at and doing the research on cancer tissue has an abnormality relative to healthy tissue, where cancer tissue is 90% water, whereas the healthy tissue is 67% water. So, Cope, what we could do is we could measure the NMR signal of the water. And they should be different, and therefore we would then have a measurement for non-invasively looking at the human body by measuring the water hydrogen signal. Well, he wasn't interested, and he didn't want to do it, so I went to the president of the company. It was a small company with about 50 employees, and asked if I could bring back samples from malignant tissue and put them in the scanner to test this hypothesis. His name was Paul Yike. He said, sure, come on back. So I came back with the sample, and this is the apparatus. And what you see is that we, as I told you, we stimulate the atom and the nucleus with a radio signal that goes in, and that nucleus of the atom answers back with its own radio signal, and this is that signal I'm showing on the oscilloscope. Now, this is the RF NMR apparatus on the left that I'm using, and one of the things that's kind of intriguing is that this was the apparatus I used at the time. Today, it's a chip. It's just totally different on all the NMR technologies that we use and install today, but that's what it was back then. And so just to give you an idea of what this is, you see the white wave, that is the transmitting radio signal going into the hydrogen atom, and you see the hydrogen atom producing the signal that is answering back to that stimulating radio signal. And that signal has some characteristics. It's got a magnitude we call the amplitude, and it's got a decay time. As you'll see, the decay time turned out to be a critical dimension. Well, the reason I was excited that we might be able to do something here is if you looked at that decay time of the water hydrogen in its two classic forms, either as ice or as liquid water, when you measured that decay time of liquid water, you got 3,000 milliseconds. When you measured the decay time of the same water in its crystal form, it was 0.019 milliseconds. So there was going to be a dramatic difference in these NMR signals that you could be detecting in the living tissue. And this is what just a rough qualitative demonstration of what liquid water would look like relative to ice water, and the marked increase in the decay time, relaxation time of the liquid water. So I was at the State University of Newark doing my research, and I wrote a proposal to the Health Research Council of the City of New York to try to get money for this research. And this is what I wrote in my letter to Dr. Myrick, I wrote, I will make, Dr. Myrick, every effort, myself and through collaborators, to establish that all tumors can be recognized by their potassium relaxation times or water proton spectra, and proceed with the development of instrumentation and probes that can be used to scan the human body externally for early signs of malignancy, detection of internal tumors during the earliest stages of their genesis should bring us very close to the total eradication of this disease. And this was sent to Dr. Myrick in 1969. Well, this is what I went ahead and measured the signals, and I measured that decay time, just as I was describing to you. And to my great delight, when I looked at the decay time, called the relaxation time of the tumor, it was profoundly different from that same measured relaxation time of the healthy tissue. So, for example, here, a cancer of the liver was 826 milliseconds as compared to a healthy liver, which was 293 milliseconds. So there was a dramatic difference indeed, as I had hoped there would be, between cancer tissue and healthy tissue, and meaning that we may have a way of non-invasively affecting disease. This is another measurement of a sarcoma of 736 milliseconds, and its counterpart normal muscle of 538 milliseconds. So there was indeed genuine distinction between the decay time of the signal of the cancer and the normal. So we published this in 1971, in March of 1971, and we wrote, at present, early detection of internal neoplasms is hampered by the relatively high permeability of many tumors to X-rays. And what that's really saying is that the problem you had with standard medical imaging by X-ray is that the X-ray didn't differentiate the vital tissues. It passed through them all equally. So it didn't produce any contrast in the pixels of the image, so you couldn't see anything on an X-ray of the vital tissues of the body, the brain, the heart, the kidney, liver, and spleen. On the other hand, what's pointing out here, in principle, nuclear magnetic resonance, this technology that I was using, in principle, nuclear magnetic resonance techniques combine many of the desirable features for the detection of internal cancer. Well, I did these experiments at the NMR Specialties, and a scientist that was on the board of directors, Dr. Paul Lauterbur, saw the numbers, and he said, well, wait a minute. With these number differences that Damadian has discovered, we can use those number differences to make a picture. We can make a map using those signals. And he produced the first ever image of two 1mm test tubes in an NMR machine. Well, after I got this published, it happened to be coincidentally at the very point in time when President Richard Nixon had just announced to the world that he was declaring his war on cancer. And he was going to allocate $1 billion a year for the next 6 years to overcome and win the war on cancer. Well, I got a call from the chairman of the division that he had appointed at the National Institute of Health. He says, Dr. Damadian, I read your papers in Science. He said, we'd like to follow up on your test tube experiments for the ultimate possibility that maybe you could eventually build a magnet big enough to do it on a human being. I said, I want to invite you to please submit an application for the contract. So I did submit an application for the contract. And the contract was given to me. It was given to Carlton Hazelwood at Baylor University, and also to Donald Hollis at Johns Hopkins University. We all three of us got the contract. As we proceeded in our research, he called a great conference a year later so we could review all of the achievements and developments that people had. And it was the Cancer Diagnosis Division. It wasn't just NMR. And I got up and gave the first talk on the NMR. And I was able to say, well, we've done the same thing on tissues from rats, and we've got the same abnormal NMR signal relaxations from live rat tissues. So it looks like it's consistent. Dr. Hazelwood got up and said, I repeated Damadian's experiments. I got the same abnormal relaxation times that he did. And Dr. Hollis got up and he said, I repeated the experiments of Damadian. I got the same abnormal relaxation times as Damadian, but I measured the relaxation time in diseased tissue that wasn't cancerous, and I got the same abnormal relaxation times. Therefore, I have to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, that any further discussion of scanning the human body by NMR is visionary nonsense, which at the time was devastating because my contract was up for renewal, and here the whole thing was being essentially demolished. But what's kind of interesting about this also was years later we ended up in a big patent fight with General Electric because we had the pioneer patents on the MRI machine, and they were taking it, and we had a big patent fight with them. And in the final battle in the courtroom, the General Electric lawyers made the same argument. Hey, I want you ladies and gentlemen of the jury to understand that this abnormality that Damadian discovered on the abnormal decay time of cancer tissue is not unique to cancer tissue. It's also a same altered decay time in a diseased tissue that's not malignant. And our attorneys responded and said, wait a minute, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, are you going to punish the guy because his original discovery detects more disease than he originally envisioned? And gratefully, we won on that part. Now, I was then asked to go to a symposium of NMR physicists because they wanted to know what this discovery was all about and how we had done it. And one of the characteristics when you did the NMR spectroscopy, the standard practice in doing the chemistry was to spin the test tube at 10,000 RPM to overcome the inhomogeneities in the magnet and the magnetic field. So after I gave my conference at the NMR physicists convention, the chairman got up and said, well, now, Dr. Damadian, how fast do you propose to spin the patient? Well, what we had to contend with is we were trying to go ahead and do this in a human body. We had this tiny little coil here, the antenna being right around the sample, and we were talking now to try to do it in a human body, we were going to have an antenna that was going to be 10 inches away from the signal-producing tissue. Are we going to be able to get a signal at all? I mean, everybody thought the thing was absurd. Are we going to be able to pick up a signal with an antenna that's 20 inches in diameter and miles away from the signal-generating sample? Well, I sat down and I came to the conclusion I couldn't use an ordinary magnet. I couldn't use ordinary copper wire. I was going to have to use superconducting wire that would be able to take a flow of thousands of amperes of current, which ordinary copper wire couldn't do because of the resistance. And so I sat down and I got hold of the MagMap calculation to calculate the magnetic field. This is the original MagMap I used. I calculated the magnetic field, and my computation showed that I was going to need 30 miles of wire, 150,000 feet. So I went ahead and I looked into see what kind of money was I going to have to come up with to buy the 30 miles of wire. Well, I found out that the maker of it was Westinghouse, and the cost was $1 a foot. So it was going to cost me $150,000 for 30 miles of wire at 5,000 feet to the foot. So I didn't have anywhere close to that. I had $15,000 in my budget. And I said, oh, well, I don't know what. Well, I said, in the meantime, until I figure out where to get the money to buy this 130 miles of wire, I'll call the sales engineer that I've been working with, Steve Lane at Westinghouse, and ask him to teach me how to make the joints. Because the wire didn't come on one spool. It was going to come on 30 spools. And when I made the joint, there was the real possibility that I was going to inject resistance in that joint and destroy the superconductivity of the wire. So I called Steve Lane up and I said, Steve, will you teach me how to make these joints? Well, his response is, wait a minute, what are you doing, Damadian? Are you going into competition with Westinghouse? I said, no, Steve. I said, I'm just trying to make these joints because I want to build a magnet big enough to put a human being into, and I need to learn how to make the joints. So he says to me, well, Damadian, he says, good, you level with me. I said, what are you talking about, Steve? He said, well, nobody knows this yet, but I'll share with you something that nobody knows. I said, what are you talking about, Steve? He said, well, Westinghouse is going out of the business of making superconducting wire, which they had been making for 23 years. And and he didn't have any idea that what I needed and so on. I have about 30 miles of wire in my warehouse, which I will let you have at 10 cents on the dollar. So instead of $150,000, it was going to be $15,000. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was dumbfounded by it. They've been making it for 23 years. He doesn't have any idea what I'm doing. At the very instant I'm needed, it's available at 1/10 the price. I said, what a coincidence that is. I couldn't believe what was going on. So I mentioned it to my mother-in-law, Amy Terry and Bo Terry. And I said to my mother-in-law, I said, I can't believe this extraordinary coincidence. They're evangelical Christian. She says, not a coincidence, Raymond. I said, what do you mean it's not a coincidence? She said, ever since your father and I knew that you had this aspiration to build this human scanner, we've been praying for you. This is not a coincidence, Raymond. It's an answer to prayer. As a result, certifying in my own mind that the revelation of the MRI was God's gift to mankind. And just as the Apostle Paul had certified in his famous Colossians that, quote, in Colossians 2:3, in Christ are hid all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, and that was happening right before our eyes. Well, we got together, and we had gotten some of this money, and you see me here with my two graduate students, Larry Minkoff and Ken Zahner, and we're standing in front of a superconducting magnet. This is a magnet with a small portal in it, about 4 inches, so we could go ahead and do the testing of a basic idea. We got successful results, and we decided to go ahead and try to build a human magnet. So here I am with my two graduate students, Dr. Michael Goldsmith and Dr. Michael Stanford, and we're winding the first of the big donuts that we had calculated for this human MRI magnet. And this is the liquid helium container that was going to maintain helium in its liquid form so that the wire would superconduct and we could get the thousands of amperes that we wanted into the wire to make it possible to get this to work. Well, when I went ahead to try to seal the second container, it continued to leak, and I was unable to get that to develop the vacuum that I needed to have the second magnet coil. So I only had one magnet coil that was going to work, and we decided, well, let's go ahead and try to give it a shot on just the one magnet coil instead of the double Helmholtz coil that you originally envisioned. So this is that one magnet coil. We gave it the name Indomitable, and you see the liquid helium port in the center and the two liquid nitrogen ports on either side, with my two graduate students helping me do this, Dr. Michael Goldsmith and Larry Minkoff. Well, when it came the moment to try to do the first human scan, we ran acutely short of willing volunteers until it was decided that by some manner of consensus, the individual who most deserved this moment of glory was the silly fool who thought it up. Well, anyway, so in order to be safe on this, I got into the coil. I had a cardiologist present, hooked up to an EKG machine, defibrillator, shock paddles, and all we got from this effort was a normal EKG. We had fun. Okay, didn't work. And we had, in fact, verified that it was visionary nonsense. Well, while I was scrambling around to see why in the world this worked, Goldsmith had the temerity for the first hypothesis. Goldsmith had made this coil. Remember, we started with a few millimeters coil and it had to get progressively bigger. Goldsmith had taken on the responsibility to try to make a coil big enough that would still work, and he was able to get it up to a 20-inch diameter that would still get a signal. So when I got in there and it failed, Goldsmith had the temerity to suggest that the reason that it had failed was that I was too fat for his coil. And that what was happening was I was loading the impedance of his coil and destroying the signal. So we call that the Goldsmith too fat hypothesis. Well, there was only one way to address the Goldsmith too fat hypothesis, was to get somebody skinnier to get in there. My graduate student, Larry Minkoff. But he wouldn't get in there. And finally, with the consistent and continuous encouragement from myself and Goldsmith, he walks in one day on July 2nd, and he says, okay, I'll get in Indomitable just to test the Goldsmith too-fat hypothesis. And so by the time we got in, everything working and got a signal, it was midnight of July 2nd, 1977. Now, I had this arranged with a focus spot so that there would be only one spot the size of a pea that would produce a signal, and all the rest of the signal from outside the pea would not produce a signal. So I positioned that spot, that focus spot, in the center of Larry's heart, where there was plenty of water in the blood on the water, expecting that if it was going to work, I should get a strong signal from the water hydrogens in Larry's heart. Well, I put it there, and I got a signal. I said, holy smokes, the Goldsmith too-fat hypothesis may have been on track. So now came the acid test. I've got that spot in the center where it's loaded with water in his heart, and now I'm going to move the spot, I'm going to move him, so the spot moves over 2 inches. And if this is working, the focus spot should now be in the center of his lung, where there's no water and no hydrogen, and the signal should go away if this is working. So I held my breath, we held our breath. I moved Larry over 2 inches, and astoundingly, the signal went away. I said to my graduate students, holy smokes, this is actually going to work. So we went ahead step by step. We collected the signals from 106 points around his anatomy, and you see what I was telling you, no signal in Larry's lung, but a healthy signal in the soft muscle tissue around the outside and in the center of his heart as well. Now I gave this to our computer engineer, Joel Stutman, and he interpolated this into a complete image. And this, you're now looking at the first ever MRI scan of a human being that was completed at 4:45 a.m. the morning of July 3rd, 1977. And of course, we saw a pronounced strong signal from the musculature of the chest, a strong signal from a cut across the aorta, and even the hint of structure on the inside of the heart, which I put down as too good to be true, but is actually what we saw in that scan. And we were naturally very excited. It was a fantastic success as far as we were concerned. The first human image, and giving us in amazing detail pictures of the heart, the lungs, the vertebra, and the musculature at Larry Minkoff's nipple level. And visionary nonsense had become actually a reality. We went in and did some other examinations, and the abnormal signal that I showed you from cancer tissue produced this image, which was a tumor of the acoustic nerve, and you see the pronounced difference in the signal of the tumor as a relative to the surrounding tissue, establishing, of course, that we were going to be able to detect diseased tissue with this technology. Now, the long and short of it is to recognize that what makes the image is this signal, this radio signal we get from the atoms of the body. And this is just a characterization of the difference in the decay time or relaxation time of the cancer signal relative to the normal signal. Now, the long and short of it is, what did the decay time, the abnormal decay time, the T1 and T2, contribute to medicine? What did it do with respect to making achievements in medical imaging? And the long and short is it provided something that medical imaging previous to that with X-ray had been unable to do. It delivered the missing pixel contrast. Now, the pixel is just a short word in medical imaging for picture element. And when you looked at an X-ray image and you looked at the picture elements that made the picture, you couldn't see any differences in the pixels of the vital tissues. What T1 and T2 did was give us the contrast so that we could actually see differences in pixel contrast and get a genuine detailed image. The pixel is what makes the image. And here's a demonstration of what I'm talking about. This is an MRI image showing a tumor at the base of the brain, a cerebellar tumor, enlarged here, and enlarged large enough so that you can see these picture elements that make up the image. So you can see the pixels. And the real what the T1 and T2 did was enable us to get differences in the brightness of the pixels so you could make an image. Now this is another example where I took the T1s and T2 values of the normal and I made them all the same and made the image again, and you see that in the absence of the T1 and T2 relaxations needed to generate the pixel contrast, the image became a blank. So what the NMR discovery of those signals that I showed you achieved was, for the first time in medical history, the ability to create the critical pixel contrast. At the same time, well, this is what I was just telling you, we had overcome a major deficiency in medical imaging. The pixel contrast needed to visualize detail in the body's vital organs had finally been achieved. Pixel contrast for a medical image at last. Well, let's see, what are we talking about there? Well, I didn't talk about this before, but now what we were getting the benefit of is that in order to determine, as I showed you before, whether the cancer signals were abnormal, I had to run the normal tissues. And I was surprised to discover that when I ran the normal tissues, they themselves had big differences. So intestine was 257 milliseconds in soft tissue, brain was 600 milliseconds, and if I calculated how much difference there was in the healthy tissues themselves, the answer was there was 131% difference. But what this overcame was a major deficiency in X-ray imaging, because when you did X-ray imaging and CAT scanning, the maximum difference you could get in the pixel was 4%. And here, the T1 and T2 was giving us 131% and giving us the prospect of getting and achieving real detail in human medical images. Well, this is showing the two images side by side. The image on the left is an X-ray CAT scan image, and the image on the right is an MRI image, and you see the differences that this pixel contrast is given. If you look at the MRI image, you see the distinction between the gray matter and the white matter. You see the thalamic nuclei. When you look at the X-ray image, you can't see a distinction between the gray matter and white matter. You can barely make out the thalamic nuclei. And in addition, on the MRI image, you can see all the subdural structures of the brain. You can't see anything over here on the X-ray image. Now then, a conventional image I'm showing you of an MRI image of high resolution today to show you what the MRI and those relaxation differences achieve. If you look, for example, in the skull at the cranial nerve, what you could all of a sudden see for the first time is the vestibular roots, those roots in the center, and the cochlear roots inside the nerve. You could see this gray matter, white matter structure that I was telling you. And if you looked more specifically at the hypothalamus, and you looked at the infundibulum that went from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, you could actually see within that hypothalamus the hypothalamic tract. So this capacity to visualize detail generated by the discovery of these relaxation time tissue differences was really profound and dramatic, and it's given us an imaging technology today that is just staggering in its potential for helping human life. And all I could say was this was a verification of a provision in Bible Proverbs, chapter 8, verse 12, quote, "I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and I find out knowledge of witty inventions, the gift of the Lord." Now, the technology that I was showing you was also a different kind of MRI than the conventional MRI. It was an upright MRI instead of a lie-down MRI. And this is what the patient sits in, walks in, sits down, and watches television. And we ship our magnets with a 43-inch TV, so you can sit there and watch TV during the scan. But most importantly, it's a multi-position scanner, so you can take the patient and put them in virtually any position. You can stand them up, you can lie them down, and most importantly, you can ask the patient, please, to put himself in the position that generates pain. And a classic example of that is if you talk to somebody with low back pain, they'll tell you that when they're lying horizontally and flat, they don't have any pain. the pain comes when they stand up. Well, in a conventional MRI, the conventional recumbent MRI then says to them, good, so lie down and we'll take a picture. Well, they're taking a picture when there's no pathology to see. But what we're able to do with the upright MRI is to ask the patient to position themselves in the position that generates the pain, so we can snap a picture in that position and know exactly what the problem is. So this existence of the MRI then generated a new medical revolution, which I'm identifying as the CSF revolution, which would be surprisingly congruent with the name of your organization. But this is a different CSF than your CSF. This is cerebrospinal fluid revolution. And to be more specific, if you look at the brain, you have this structure in the center of the brain called the ventricles of the brain. And the ventricles of the brain manufacture this fluid, manufacture this cerebrospinal fluid. There's a cord, there's a plexus of vessels here, the choroid plexus. They squeeze and they put this cerebrospinal fluid into the ventricle. And now that cerebrospinal fluid comes out through the aqueduct of Sylvius, and it goes all the way down to the tailbone at the rate of 32 quarts a day. And what the MRI has allowed us to do for the first time in history is actually visualize real time the flow of this 32 quarts of cerebrospinal fluid going in and out of the brain. Actually able to visualize CSF flow directly for the first time in medical history. And here you see it. Well, you see the spinal cord coming down, and you see on the back of the cord black and white. Now, when it's black, that's the circulation of the spinal fluid during diastole. And as those of you who know the cardiac cycle, you have the systolic, this CSF is in sync with the cardiac cycle. And the cardiac cycle has a phase when the heart contracts, that's called systole, and when the heart relaxes, that's called diastole. And what you're seeing here is, if you look carefully, the black fluid is the fluid during diastole. And so what you're seeing is that the inflow of the cerebrospinal fluid into the brain, the inflow is during diastole. And then if you look carefully, you see it turning white. The outflow is the systole. But it's all of a sudden now we have, with this new technology, the ability to visualize directly in real time the physiology of this critical fluid that's circulating at the rate of 32 quarts a day. But even more, we had the ability not only to see it, but to actually quantify it and measure how much in cc's per second it's doing. This is an example of what we have been able to achieve in a Parkinson's patient. The Parkinson's patient came to us, and the three columns on the right are the measurements of the cerebrospinal fluid flow in the normal. And the columns on the left are the measurements that we made in the Parkinson's patient. Well, if you look at the normal for the total diastolic flow, the total number of cc's, what you saw in the normal was 0.26 seconds. When you looked at the patient with Parkinson's, it was half that, 0.13. But better yet, when we treated her and we produced the cranial-cervical realignment that eliminated the obstruction, gratefully, her CSF flow doubled and became normal. If we looked at just another measurement in cc's per second, the normal was 0.88 as compared with the pathology of 0.57, and when after the treatment that I'm going to describe you more to, it doubled and she was back to normal. So I looked at those numbers which Dr. Rosa sent to me, and I said, oh, that's wonderful. Her CSF flow doubled as a result of the realignment treatment of a cranial-cervical junction. But those are the numbers. Did it have any impact on her symptoms? So I called her up. I said, no, I'm pleased to see the results. Your CSF flow doubled. Did it have any impact on your Parkinson's disease? She said, yeah, I'm cured, which is just wonderful and staggering. And the other curious thing about Parkinson's disease, by the way, it's been a strange phenomenon in the practice of medicine, because neurologists and neurophysiologists have always been able to determine from the patient, when they ask the patient the symptoms, it's always straightforward from the neurophysiological conjunction that the pathology is at the base of the brain. But the confounding aspect of this for many decades was that when you subsequently, at a later time, during autopsy, looked at the base of the brain, you didn't find any pathology. So how could you have these symptoms at the base of the brain and no pathology? Well, what we now know is the symptoms are coming from the turbulence of the CSF flow, and there is no tissue injury. But the good news, as I just showed you, is there's no damaged tissue. So if you successfully treat the patient, they're not going to have a permanent deficiency from tissue pathology, because there isn't any. Now, what brought all of this to our attention was our discovery regarding multiple sclerosis. And when I went ahead and looked at patients carefully, the first thing that you knew about an MRI of a patient with multiple sclerosis is that what you saw in the image, the lesions around the ventricles of the brain, they were called periventricular lesions. And that was known. But when I looked at the patient, I saw something else. I saw these lesions that were periventricular connected directly to the cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricle, strongly suggesting that the multiple sclerosis was coming about because of leakage of the cerebrospinal fluid into the brain tissue. Well, the spinal fluid is not benign stuff. It has 300 polypeptides in it, 9 of which are antigens, which generate antibodies. Here's another cut. This is an axial cut, and you see on the multiple sclerosis patient that leakage of cerebrospinal fluid going into the surrounding tissue, producing these periventricular lesions that are the classic mark of multiple sclerosis. And here's another image of the same, showing in the multiple sclerosis patient that it was arising from this leakage of cerebrospinal fluid. But we published this paper in 2011, showing that this multiple sclerosis was arising from the leakage of CSF. But we made another discovery that we didn't expect. We measured the flow of CSF in the two positions, in the recumbent position and in the upright position. And what we discovered, which initially I thought was just a mistake in the measurement, that the CSF flow, when you were upright, the flow of CSF into your brain dropped by 40%. Now, looking at this more carefully, this is what things are like in the anatomy in your neck. You have in your neck, you have a stack of 7 vertebrae, and each of them has a tubercle at the side of the vertebra that the vertebral artery goes through. Okay, and that's 7 vertebrae where this vertebral artery is going through. And what you're looking at here is you see the bone of the skull, then the first one, C1, the atlas vertebra, and then the next one, the axis that provides the axis of rotation. And this is what the anatomy looks like if you look at it a little bit more in detail. So here's the skull here. This is the first one, C1, the atlas, and this is the second one, C2, the axis. And what you're seeing here is the axis has a vertical bone, a unique bone, that sticks up into the center of C1, and that's why it's called the axis of rotation. That bone is the dens. And what you see is that dens is attached to the skull by a pair of ligaments called the alar ligaments. And when you get whiplash injuries to the neck, you tear these ligaments. You tear them to a harsh degree, you tear them to a small degree, but you tear them. And there's another ligament that comes across the back, and that's this guy right here. That's the transverse ligament. So if I look at it from the top, I see that dens bone, I see the alar ligaments, and I see the transverse ligament coming across the back. Well, I've been working very carefully with a brilliant AO chiropractor, Scott Rosa. And what's happening, and when we see the malalignments of C1 and C2 that are causing all the symptomatology, I send the patient to Dr. Rosa, and he does an atlas orthogonal realignment to eliminate the obstruction in the CSF flow, and we're having a dramatically success with these patients. Now, this is what the atlas orthogonal machine looks like. And Dr. Rosa would take into his hand something that looks like a power drill, which you see right here, and it's got a stem about 3 inches long, and it's a hollow stem. And it has a plunger on the inside of it. And he takes that and puts it right behind the earlobe. And when he does that, he's right up within millimeters away from this transverse process of C1. And he taps on it and puts that mal-rotated C1 back into position. Well, it's important to understand all this because there are currently 1.2 million automobile whiplasheries every year. And we're seeing an epidemic of patients with this cranial cervical syndrome. And the characteristic symptoms of the cranial cervical syndrome is overwhelming headaches, commonly at the base of the skull, dizziness, visual changes, inability to walk and maneuver when it gets severe enough. And it's a very severe problem today, which I have identified as a pandemic because it's a virtual epidemic that's coming from the dislocation of these bones. And we have identified it by the upright MRI, and I'm going to show you the details, that produces these cervical dislocations. But what do the cervical dislocations do? They obstruct the flow of this critical cerebrospinal fluid, and that's what produces all the symptomatology. Now, here's the first MS patient that Dr. Rosa treated. Well, what you see is the patient before his treatment, and you see the lesions here in his axial cut, and you see the lesions here, and then after he realigned them and treat them, the lesions have gone away in this patient. This is multiple sclerosis patient number 1. This is the same patient, the lesions before his realignment treatment and the disappearance of the lesions after treatment. The same patient here, the lesion that then went away after realignment. And now here's another one, a second multiple sclerosis patient. This is the lesion before he treats, and then here's the patient's lesion after the treatment is complete. But the other thing is that the MRI has achieved for the first time a genuine revolution, because of its ability for the first time in history to be able to make real-time movies of the cerebrospinal fluid as it goes in and out of the brain. And I'm going to show you the impact that these pathologies have on the obstruction of that CSF flow. So here is a multiple sclerosis patient. Now, the video that you're seeing on the right is a video of the normal volunteer. And you see in front of the cord, you see normal CSF flow going in and out, and you see in back of the cord, the dorsal CSF we call, also, and the normal volunteer going in and out. And also, you need to recognize that you're looking at a slice. And if you had the complete three-dimensional image, that flow in and out of the brain would be a cylinder of cerebrospinal fluid circulation. But take a look at the multiple sclerosis patient. What you see dorsal to the cord compared with the volunteer is obstruction of that cerebrospinal fluid flow. And that's really the basic origin of this multiple sclerosis symptomatology. Now, the net result of this is that these dislocations and interference and obstruction of CSF flow is the cause of all these neurodegenerative diseases. It's the cause of multiple sclerosis, cause of Alzheimer's, cause of childhood autism, cause of Parkinson's, we've had some people that have come to us. We had 2 ladies that came to us that were diagnosed as childhood autism. Dr. Rosa treated them, and the 2 of them were in their 30s, and both of them were cured. Now, the CSF flow obstruction we now believe to be the likely cause. My brother-in-law knew somebody who knew this famous quarterback from the Chicago Bears, Jim McMahon. And they called my brother-in-law up and said, do you think that you might find anything on Jim McMahon if you did a scan on him that made something that might be addressable or treatable? And at this point, Jim McMahon's story appeared in the local Long Island newspaper called Newsday, and he had destructive loss of his memory powers, and he was going to take his life. His lady friend would send him to the grocery store to get food. She'd get a phone call from him. He was at a gas station, and he didn't know where he was. So we brought him in, and we found, when we imaged him, a marked malrotation of his second cervical vertebra that was obstructing his CSF flow. When he was upright, it was tilted. When he was recumbent, it was closer to normal. We measured the cerebrospinal fluid on Jim McMahon, and I took him up to Dr. Rosa, who realigned him, and basically we cured him. And this is a picture of him giving his great celebration announcement alongside of Dr. Rosa, who had just treated him, basically telling the world that his syndrome was cured, that his problem no longer existed. But he had been diagnosed as concussion. Well, he didn't have a concussion. This is what the Wall Street Journal calls all of these damages that you read about every day in sports. They're all identified as concussions. This wasn't a concussion. In Jim McMahon's case, it was trauma to the neck, not the brain. And it was obstruction of CSF fluid flow. And I said to Jim, when I was talking to him, I said, you don't have a concussion. You got an obstruction of the cerebrospinal fluid flow from a malalignment in your neck. He said, oh, and the other thing that is significant is that when Dr. Rosa treated him and realigned his cranial-cervical junction, right after Rosa treated him and realigned it, Jim McMahon said to him, Dr. Rosa, I can't believe what you just did. And Rosa said, what are you talking about? He said, well, the minute you tapped me, I felt like Niagara Falls was coming out of my head. And he was essentially cured. And I spoke to him afterwards. I'd done a scan. I said, Jim, I said, you don't have concussion. You have obstruction of CSF flow from a malalignment of your cranial-cervical junction. He said, it's amazing you're telling me that, Doc. I said, why? He says, because when all of us young guys joined the NFL, the coaches all told us the same thing. Go for the neck. But he didn't have concussion. He had the malalignment of his flow. Now, when I gave some talks, and I got a call from a lady who was having very severe medical problems. She was having drop attacks. So you'd be talking to her, and all of a sudden she'd collapse on the floor, and she'd be unconscious for 30 seconds to a minute. And she came and said, well, is there anything that we can do to help her? Well, I took her up to Dr. Rosa. He did the realignment. Her drop attacks stopped. And here she's announcing with great ecstasy, for 4 years, she was having a drop attack every 2 days. And here she is in ecstasy announcing that she hasn't had a drop attack in 300 days. And of course, what was happening was by the realignment, we were taking away the pinching of that vertebral artery and essentially eliminating her drop attacks. Now, the last thing, of course, to call attention to is that one of the other attributes of the upright MRI is you can do pediatric imaging. So you can take an infant and put him in the scanner sitting upright. You don't have to anesthetize him in order to make him still, and he can go and sit on his mommy's lap while you're doing a scan. So this is an example of a pediatric image done with the infant sitting on the mother's lap, and it has a major role in addressing this calamity of cerebral palsy. Today, there are 12,393 cerebral palsy being diagnosed every year in the United States. Globally, there are approximately 17 million people that have cerebral palsy. And in the U.S., there are 764,000 patients that have cerebral palsy. And this is what it looks like on the MRI image. That ventricle that I showed you is drastically swollen. And you're seeing a T2 image, and this is a T1 image, but the conspicuous thing is the dramatic ventriculomegaly of the ventricles of the brain. Well, what the medical profession has done is it wrote that they're having these images. And these children, by the way, the cerebral palsy is a consequence of birth trauma. So they're showing up in these children within a year or two after birth. And what the neurosurgeons, once they were able to address this, recognized they could put a duct in the ventricle and allow that cerebrospinal fluid to drain out in the posterior fossa. This is what it looks like on a coronal cut. And as a result, we have a cure for this problem of cerebral palsy. And as I mentioned to you, this other thing that we discovered when we did the original measurement was that when you were upright, the flow of cerebrospinal fluid into and out of your head in the normal flow dropped by 40%. And so this was a new discovery, that the flow during diastole of your cerebrospinal fluid drops 40% in your normal when you're upright. So what it's reporting to you is the role of why you sleep at night. Because what happens when you sleep at night, the cerebrospinal fluid flow to your brain doubles. And you have a complete what does this cerebrospinal fluid do? What's its function? It's the irrigation system of the brain. It's washing the brain. And it's clearing out all the chemical byproducts of metabolism, and that's why you sleep every night. Your sleep is CSF cleansing or irrigation of the brain. Consequently, the MRI revolution has therefore provided to us for the first time, and I showed you the images, real-time visualization of cerebrospinal fluid physiology, and for the first time in medical history has established its critical role to life itself. Thank you. I can address any questions. Can you get the light for me? I'm glad to address as many questions as you have. Yes.
My name is Mark Quigley. I did a fair amount of research in CSF flow at the University of Wisconsin.
I'm sorry, what?
My name is Mark Quigley. I did a fair amount of research on CSF flow, axial, at the University of Wisconsin a while back. One thing I've wondered about, well, this is all Chiari patients, but one thing I've wondered about is Alzheimer's. Do you think that could possibly be a consequence?
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, we measured on the Alzheimer's. They have a dramatic impairment of CSF flow.
Because I always wanted to do a proposal on that, and everybody I knew was that it's a crackpot idea.
I'll show you one of the pieces of evidence. One of the characteristics of Alzheimer's is what has been identified as the appearance of the tau protein in the Alzheimer's nodule. Well, the tau protein is not part of the parenchyma of the tissue. It's not there. Where's it coming from?
What, I assume from the CSF?
It's in the CSF. That's where those tau proteins in Alzheimer's disease are originating. And that's just simply, further establishing that the disease is the result of the interference of the normal physiology of CSF flow.
Do you think that's...
But what this is also saying is you can take these patients with Alzheimer's and realign them and make them better.
Well, that's going to be my question. Do you think there's some, maybe an increase in the viscosity? I'm just asking.
No, I don't think it's viscosity. It's just a matter of the flow going where it shouldn't be going. Well, but the point is that if you eliminate the obstruction of the CSF flow that's causing the leakage, you can overcome Alzheimer's.
I found that, this isn't published, one thing I found around the ages of 12 or 14 years old, pediatric versus, say, teenage or adult Chiari patients, and normal subjects, actually, you see around the C2 up to foramen magnum, you see a change in the nature of CSF flow by quite a bit.
With aging, you mean?
At between 12 and 14 years old. Younger than that, these kids have what I call pediatric flow pattern. When they get older than that, it changes quite a bit into an adult flow pattern. Have you ever seen that about?
I haven't examined that, so I can't answer your question.
Maybe I can talk to you a little bit.
No, I'm glad you told my attention. We can go ahead and do it. I mean, just do what you ask.
Okay, good.
Just call us up and we'll run the scan. Yes.
Okay, so I have a question about the MS patients, the two cases that you've shown.
I got that here.
Sorry. So the MS patient that you showed, so you showed initially a patient that had an enhancing lesion and then he was realigned, and then the
Yeah.
lesion is. What was the time difference between those scans? A couple of weeks ago.
I can't answer that
Right.
because
But the reason
I got those images from Dr. Rosa. So,
Right, so-
no, wait. I think he told me 4 to 6 months, but
Okay,
it's
so
a guess.
we see lots of patients with MS in our practice. That's a pretty normal evolution of an active lesion. So I'm not.
What you have to do is send them to us in the upright, and we'll measure and visualize the extent of the lesions and the leakage, and then treat them and try to get assurance that the lesions have gone away. And coincidentally, measure quantitatively the CSF flow of the multiple sclerosis patient before treatment, and establish that after the treatment has been done, the CSF flow has come back to normal. That's eminently doable. Yes.
Do you have an estimate of what percentage of concussions are really not concussions and actually upper
Well,
cervical?
you're asking a critical question, and I think they're all being diagnosed as concussions because nobody has recognized the powerful role of craniocervical cerebrospinal fluid flow. Nobody is really appreciating the critical physiology of that cerebrospinal fluid flow and how sensitive it is to traumas to the neck.
Yeah.
So that's what we want to do. We want to get the medical community educated so we can overcome all these problems and not cause them concussion. And the bizarre thing about concussion, by the way, when they get diagnosed as concussion, you do an image, you don't see anything.
Yeah.
The doctor just called it concussion, and there's nothing on the image to see because it's not in the brain. It's in the flow of this. But you see, the thing to recognize is this cerebrospinal fluid physiology is all brand new. That has been visualized for the first time ever by the MRI. Yes.
So when you're talking about realignment of the C1,
Pardon me?
you were talking about realignment of the C1, C2,
Yeah.
right? Is that safe to do with the presence of the Cranial fluid?
Is that safe to do what?
Is that safe to do with the presence of the Cranial fluid?
Dr. Rosa does it regularly, and what we see happen is the Chiari malformation tonsils lift up. And let me explain what's going on there. What's happening is when you have an obstruction of CSF flow, it backs up in the brain and puts increased pressure in the brain, and that's what's causing the brain to go down and get the Chiari malformation. So we've done the realignments and we've lifted up the cerebral tonsils. So, and the long and short of it, I believe it can help. But, you have to do these examinations very carefully in the upright MRI, measure the amount of cerebellar tonsil descent, and then track it by post-treatment images and measure the extent to which you've lifted it up. But it can make a difference. Yes?
Is it only certain radiologists?
I mean, what?
Is it special radiologists who can read the tilting of the C1, C2?
No, in a general way, the radiologists are not doing this because this is all brand new. The ones I talk to, or the ones we send images to, we show them to them, and then once we show them, I want them realigned, and we do it. But it's only a tiny fraction of all the people that are suffering from this. It's generally not big size.
So if you suspect it, and where would you go?
Oh, well, you come to a sonar upright machine, and we'll stand you upright and measure the CSF flow. We'll know on equipment. We have 150 of these machines installed around the United States. But the place where we have the most direct presence of them is in New York City and Florida. We have them. And we just call up Phonar Corporation, that's the name of our company, and ask for my assistant, Ellen. Ellen, yes. And sending to Dr. Damadian said that we can send you patients to be evaluated under the upright MRI, and she'll schedule your patients.
Yes.
I don't have a
question, but I have two comments. The first one is that this idea was surfaced in neurosurgical circles by Ed Oldfield, who at the time was the chief of neurosurgery at NIH. And Ed, after clinical observations of Chiari patients, said that he thought the pathology that created the syrinx and created the brainstem abnormalities was this disruption of CSF. But of course, at that time, he had no way to measure it, and it remained just a hypothesis made
Well, the
on
miracle is we're able to
grounds.
visualize it.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, that's just wonderful. I thank the Lord for giving that to us, because it's just miraculous.
My other comment has to do with your timing you showed of your final experiment between midnight and 4:35 a.m. The great neurophysiologist at Hopkins, Vernon Mountcastle, always said, all great science is done after midnight. And I think you're proof of the Mountcastle.
Yeah, well, that was literally a miracle. And my wife doesn't allow me to make this comment, but I'm going to let it out anyway. And I told you that when we moved Larry over, the signal went away. And I said, holy smokes, it's actually going to work. And Larry Minkoff keeps insisting the word was not smoke.
We have a question from our WebEx. We have a couple, actually. So, should Chiari patients be checked for cranial-cervical junction malalignments first when they have a syringomyelia?
Yeah, as soon as somebody says a Chiari patient, they should have cranial-cervical alignment. But more than that, also the movies and the measurement of the CSF flow. To what extent is the CSF being impacted? And on our scanners, it all gets done. So if you have a need to do it, just send them down to us in Long Island.
Okay. Another one. So someone on here has had a few realignments by chiropractors, and that he has a syrinx, and that does relieve some pain for him, but he's had neurosurgeons tell him not to go for these adjustments.
Well, it's a sensitive territory. Okay?
Yes.
Number one.
Yep.
And number two, what Dr. Rosa does different from other chiropractors is he says, I will not do an adjustment without an MRI. But a lot of these adjustments that the chiropractors do, they don't even look at the MRI. So what Dr. Rosa is doing is he's evaluating specifically with direct imaging on the abnormality of the anatomy and quantitatively its impact on the CSF. And then he makes the adjustment associated with the image. Gotcha. And then after he's done, he repeats the image to see the extent to which the realignment has been achieved and the extent to which the cerebrospinal fluid flow has some. So it really, you can't talk generically about this. You have, what he teaches is critical. I can't do this realignment without the image monitoring of the anatomy. And otherwise you're going to get very varied results. But it's all new technology. I mean, it's brand new. It's a reason that everybody's not doing it. Oh, and gratefully I'm able to report to you that Phonak Corporation has 150 patents on the upright MRI, so that none of our competitors, General Electric, Siemens, Philips, and Hitachi, are allowed to make the upright MRI. We're the only one. And we taught them in the courtroom that it's not wise to try. Yes.
So I'm not a doctor, but I work over here at Goddard Space Flight Center, so I have a background in physics and appreciate what you're saying. As a question and following on from what that person just asked, maybe it's too new for this, but in cases where it it's not wise to readjust for whatever reason, mechanically, or it's not wise to have a surgery to increase that flow, would there be any prospect to find a way to increase the flow in a different way, a pump or something to increase the flow of that fluid, even though it's constricted mechanically?
Well, yes is the answer to that. One of the procedures that's used, but we don't recommend it, is to open the foramen magnum and make it bigger. So that's one of the procedures that is in use, and it works. But of course, the nice thing about the cranial cervical realignment is it's totally non-invasive and not unintrusive. And I was discussing this before, and one of the things that I was very surprised when we were doing this work was that I would fairly commonly see a patient with a C1 and C2 malalignment and a significant herniation at C5-6 where the disc was literally impacting the cord. And what was a big surprise to me was that when we realigned C1 and C2, all the symptoms went away when there was no change at C5-6. It's like, C5 and 6 were really not the root of all of this symptomatology. The symptomatology was coming from the craniocervical junction and its impact on CSF flow.
Right.
That's fantastic. Dr. Damadian, we are so honored to have you here tonight, and we're very grateful. You have changed medicine and certainly neurosurgery for all of us. And to be here tonight was to be part of history. You're leading the new vanguard of science on CSF flow.
Oh, and its effect on the neurodegenerative diseases, its potential is enormous, and the amount of people that we can help with these disastrous conditions is staggering. I mean, we got to get it done.
So, anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The next CSF meeting will be at Johns Hopkins in 3 months. That'll be mid-April, and I spoke with Mark Luciano today, and he's arranging speakers. So I hope everyone here today can join us at Johns Hopkins in 3 months' time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.